Now time to take an overview on the Northern Wars from 1558 to 1721. Now the whole issue is rather complicated for several reasons. One aspect is the number of sources are limited. Most involved countries wrote their own history of their own wars they took part in, but not a whole overview. And also these works are often not translated in other languages. So Frost makes this very interesting aspect. This is history is also written by losers. The thing is they don't get translated. It's a very interesting perspective in that regard. And now if you look at the whole situation with the Northern Wars and this name alone, because if you look at the first Northern War, Frost notes there are basically 3 different ones. So depending who does the interpretation, there are 3 candidates. And if you look at Wikipedia, there are actually 5 candidates for the first Northern War. So, and in Frost's viewpoint, there are basically 3 Northern Wars in total. Now Frost goes with the interpretation that the first Northern War was the Livonian War, which was from 1558 to 1583. Also quite extensive amount of time. Now the second Northern War was from 1655 to 1660. And the third Northern War, the Great Northern War, was from 1700 to 1721, which ended with the decline of the Swedish Empire. Now what is the determining factor that it is called a Northern War for Frost? Basically when 3 or more major powers were involved. Now who were the major powers? The first one is Denmark-Norway, or sometimes also called the Oldenburg monarchy. So this was when Denmark and Norway were basically united. Then the second one was the Kingdom of Sweden, or sometimes also called the Swedish Empire in this timeline. Now the third one is Poland-Lithuania, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the fourth is the Tsardom of Muscovy, or Russia. I will take Russia because it's easier to pronounce and usually refers to this as well. Of course, at this point you need to be aware that Russia doesn't have control over Belarus and Ukraine yet, and is smaller in this part. This Muscovy, so the Moscow area, is way stronger. So to understand why this war happened and what were the motivations for the several major powers, we need to take a bigger look at the Baltics at this time. Now around 1500 there were several processes going on. First, the Livonian Order was in decline. Now who is the Livonian Order? This was a branch of the Teutonic Order. And they were in charge of Livonia at this point. They were in decline and thus created a power vacuum. The other aspect is the Hanseatic League was also in decline. So the Hanseatic League was the major trading organization, you could say, and they could also, their influence was shrinking their power in the Baltic seas and everywhere. And at the same time, the Baltic trade increased tremendously. So as you can see, a lot of resources, a lot of money are going on. Now, for Baltic trade, you need ports, and very important ports were Danzig, Reval, Riga and Narva. Since Poland, Lithuania and Russia brought nearly all the trade there. So controlling these ports was one aspect to get more money from trade and everything. So to a certain degree it was a fight around trade routes and economic aspects. Now additionally for Polish-Lithuania and Russia, there was also a fight amongst the control of the Slavs in the region and about the whole religious aspect. So they were not only about trade routes, they were also fighting about this. You can discuss which one was more important. Now for Denmark, it was mostly about protecting the Øresund. This was the strait between Denmark and Sweden. And from there they could basically control every ship. You can't move through there, basically, if they have the control of it. All paid passes through, and this Øresund is usually also called the Sounds in English. And they were the Sounds due or the Sound tolls. So they collected a lot of money there. Because basically all the trade which was going out had to pass through there from the Baltic Sea. Of course the Russians also had Archangel as a port, but as you can tell it's rather remote to the far north. Now if you look at Sweden, before it was in the Kalmar Union, it was with Denmark and Norway in a union, but it broke up before the conflict. And still it wanted to assert its independence on the naval aspects from Denmark and also on the economic level. Now Sweden back then was far larger and also included Finland and parts of Estonia. So they were basically in the area where everyone was fighting or had its interests on the ports. They had a frontier, so they also wanted to extend it or at least protect its borders. Now, what had all these four major powers in common? Basically, none was strong enough to dominate the others, at least in the beginning. So now let's take a closer look at the four major powers and what strengths and weaknesses they brought to the table. First of, Denmark-Norway. Strength, it was a strong naval power. This was also due to the fact that there was a change in the warships. So warships beforehand, you could easily transfer merchants and convert them into warships. This wasn't going so well anymore because warships were becoming heavier and heavier and thus couldn't be used as merchants anymore. And they were also mostly in control of the Baltic. Now they could afford the warships because they had the sound dues. They were collecting the tolls for every ship passing through between the strait between Sweden and Denmark, which also made them quite unpopular. They also made very good use of the fortress system there to collect the money and everything else. So it was not only for communications, but also for gaining economic power. Now, as mentioned before, an alternative was Archangel as a port. And for that, they went to Iceland and Faroe Islands and also tried to collect tolls there for ships passing there, which was not particularly well seen by England and also didn't work out. Now, a geostrategic aspect that Denmark had, which the other countries didn't have, it was directly connected to Western Europe. It was connected to Germany and also basically rather close to France and everyone else. So it had a good strategic position that the other countries only had to a certain degree. Now, what about the weaknesses? In terms of population, Denmark had the lowest numbers. Around 1600, they had around 600,000 men. If you take Denmark and Norway and the other parts of the Oldenburg monarchy within it, you came up to 1.5 million at most. Another aspect is they were lacking mineral resources. So their economy was basically on agriculture and fishing. Then the tolls from the Sound Duel also got into the royal coffin and not into the state coffin. As such, since they had an elective monarchy and also a council, the people were quite suspicious of the monarchs, of the leaders sometimes, and there was some friction among this. So, and this council also was against wider ambitions. They didn't support any military expeditions to a large degree or something else, which is quite in contrast to the Kingdom of Sweden, which we talk next. They had different strengths. They had good mineral resources, they had iron and timber, and virtually a monopoly on copper. Now, copper in this regard was important for one thing. Spain changed its coinage to copper and also for the arms industry. So copper was very important. Then there was the remoteness of Finland. So basically, if Russia or Poland-Lithuania would attack, they had to go to Finland, which was basically forested areas with sometimes some rivers and lakes in between. So as you can imagine, a logistical nightmare on a completely new scale. And if you try to attack through there, it's desperate. And another strength, which is in quite contrast to Denmark, was the government sanctioned the military adventures and also supported it in the long term with tax and everything else. So we had the Swedish ambition, whereas Denmark was more like, okay, let's just collect the money and don't get involved into too much wars, which was quite different to Sweden. Now let's look at the weaknesses. One major problem was from Sweden, it was also quite remote. I mean, it's rather close to Germany if you look on the map, but still, there was the Baltic Sea in between, and Denmark was in possession of Gotland and Bornholm, two islands there, and they also had a better fleet. So this is one major issue. There was no land bridge or something like the Danish had to Europe and Germany. And the ports were mostly icebound. This was a major issue for trade and moving anything. And this was also still a major problem in the Second World War. As you can imagine, when it was a major problem in the Second World War with iron ships, coal and everything, that with sailing ships out of wood, it was probably a huge issue. Similar to Denmark, the population was also rather small. Here we have the number for 1500, so 100 years earlier, and it's 750,000. Still rather small number, which is quite different to the other two major powers, Poland-Lithuania and the Tsardom of Russia. Which brings us to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, very important, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth started in 1569 with the Union of Lublin, and we cover the timeline, so it happens a bit after the timeline starts. Now, Poland-Lithuania is very different to Denmark and Sweden. First of all, it was huge. It included modern Ukraine and Belarus. So it's far larger than what you associate with Poland nowadays, and especially with Lithuania. And it also had a large population because it was rather fortunate in the 14th century when the Black Death raged among Europe, and Polish-Lithuania, the areas were mostly untouched. So there was no major decline in the population there. And for 1500, there's about 7.5 million estimated, and for 1650 around 11 million. Now, in terms of the political system, they had a parliament which had to consent on legislation. There was some organization, institutions and everything. And it was actually well organized for Eastern Europe. It was not some backwater country, it was they had some quite major cities. Now, there were several weaknesses. The institutions, the political institutions, were mostly only for nobles, exclusively for nobles. And the nobles made about 6 to 7.5% of the population. Then a strength and a weakness is it was rather large. So since it was so large, it also bordered to the Ottoman Empire and their vassal, the Tatars, and they regularly attacked nearly on an annual basis. And again, the economy was also mainly dependent on agriculture. Of course, this is similar for nearly all countries at this time we cover here. So the next is the Tsardom of Russia. Major strengths, it had also a large population, and the numbers differ here widely. So for 1550, the lowest estimation is 2 to 3 million. The highest is 9 to 10 million. Frost notes, most likely number is 6 to 6.5 million. Now, another major aspect here is that in the early 15th century, there was quite a lot of anarchy going on. You probably ask now, wait, how is this a strength? Well, this convinced the aristocracy to be more cooperative with the Tsar. As such, he could be way more stronger in autocratic, building up military power and controlling everything. So the aristocracy was less concerned with undermining the Tsar, but supporting him. And there was this small network of aristocratic families, the boyars, which were also rather cooperative among themselves. So you had this autocratic system mostly, but it was well supported. This of course had its weaknesses because there were no independent government institutions, and basically also Russia at this point was undergoverned, and it was expanding at the same time. So you have a certain lack of bureaucracy and everything. And another major issue was the vast distances. So due to the large areas and the rather bad infrastructure, you couldn't get as much money out of the trade and everything. Similar, the economy was also mainly based on agriculture and forest goods. Now in this video I don't cover any specific war, but the overall change, what happened in this long duration from 1558 to 1721 is basically you see the rise and fall of the Swedish Empire, and what is more importantly, the establishment as Russia as a great power. If you look at the first Northern War, in the end of it, Russia is actually beaten mostly. In the beginning it made some success, but then it's beaten. But if you look at 1721, Russia is now established as a major power in the region and in European history. Now, thank you here to all patrons voting on this topic, and a big thank you here to Ivan Bolschweiler for sending me the book The Northern Wars from Frost. Also thank you to Jack and Martin for sending me other books that I could use on this video as well. Thank you for watching and see you next time.